So the election is coming up in just a couple days here. It's just the turn of November. So something I've been really looking at recently and what I think is very interesting is because of the nature of all the craziness that's going on because of this election, what happens if there is no clear majority in the Electoral College in deciding an outcome or a victor of this election? So let's check it out. Okay, so there are 538 electors in the Electoral College that decide the outcome of the presidential election. The popular vote is supposed to inform those electors' decisions. So how are those allocated depends year on year, but there could be a tie, though very slim, about 1% in the estimates this year, in the distribution of the electoral votes between Democrat, here's a little donkey, and Republican, there's the elephant, a 269 to 269 tie. Now there are some third-party considerations like Jill Stein, George Jorgensen, that might affect the relationship this year between the vote counts, but this is one possible scenario where it might end up being a tie. Okay, so in the event of a tie in the Electoral College, the vote will go to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives will decide the next president and vice president without any serious legal consideration required of the popular or electoral votes that resulted in a tie. So how do they do this, you ask? They vote by state delegation, not by individual representative. So that basically means while the Democrats might have a representative majority, the Republicans right now have a majority by state delegation. That means they control 26 states that are Republican dominated, whereas the Democrats control 22 and the rest are independent or a split house. So this basically means that in the event that the election gets thrown to the House, the delegation from New York's vote has the exact same weight in the presidential outcome as the delegation from Nebraska's vote. Now mind you, New York has 19 million people and Nebraska only has 2 million people, but their votes will count just the same. It is important to note that while right now the Republicans hold a majority by state delegation, that's not who's going to be deciding the presidential outcome if it goes to the House. So while right now Republicans hold 26 states, there are enough state congressional elections contested by party that there could be a majority Democratic states come post-November 3rd. So the outcome of the election, if it gets thrown to the House, is also contingent upon the outcome of the races for Congress in the up-for-grabs states. So that's a very interesting factor in this whole thing. To win the House election, you're going to need a simple majority of state delegations to vote for you. So you're going to need, because there are 50 states, at least 26 states to vote in favor of you if you want to become president. An interesting factor in all this is not all states would likely vote one way or the other. There's either a majority-minority, so there's a whole bunch of different parties that make up a state coalition, or there's a really even split between the two majority Democratic or Republican parties. Either of these configurations would result in a ballot of none being cast ultimately, which basically means a state delegation can't decide on which candidate they want to vote for, so they'll ultimately not vote for any of the candidates. Now what happens when Congress itself can't decide a president by the deadline? So the original 12th Amendment basically said that if there's no president appointed by the deadline, the vice president, so now in this case Mike Pence, would take over. But when the 20th Amendment was adopted in 1933, they said that all terms, president and vice president, full stop, is done January 20th. So in the event that January 20th comes, or the deadline for inauguration comes, and Congress still hasn't decided a replacement president, they can set up the appointment process to select an interim president, or they can just appoint the interim president while they're still deciding. And that's all the original document says. So essentially, as long as they're eligible, so Betty White even could be the interim president while Congress takes the little more time it needs to appoint a replacement president. As an example of the problems that states not being able to decide might pose to an election, we look to the election of 1800. where John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson versus Aaron Burr, that election actually went to the House of Representatives. So John Adams, he only got 65 electoral votes, so he was booted. He was the incumbent president. Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson both got 73 electoral votes, so they were eligible for the election in the House. Now, the current Congress at that time who voted really liked Adams, so they thought these new guys are like, oh man, we have to choose between the lesser of two evils. So there were 36 different votes to decide who was going to be the president, because multiple state delegations didn't want to vote for either of the candidates because they didn't like either of them. So it took 36 votes for the eventual victor, Thomas Jefferson, to be approved by the House of Representatives. And a fun fact about this election, while all this was going on, it was so dragged out that Pennsylvania and Virginia started to mobilize their militia to prepare for a civil war that they thought might come because of this process. Another example, a crazier example I would say, of when the election went to the House of Representatives was the 1824 presidential elections between Henry Clay, William Crawford, John Quincy Adams, and Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson, none of them had a clear majority of electoral votes. That's why it went to the House of Representatives in the first place, as we had discussed. But Andrew Jackson had the most electoral votes and had the majority of the popular vote. So even though Henry Clay was the Speaker of the Senate at the time, he had the least amount of electoral votes, and only 3 candidates can be eligible for the House of Representatives election. So Crawford, Jackson, and John Quincy Adams went to the House of Representatives vote. Henry Clay went to John Quincy Adams and said, bro, if you make me your Secretary of State, I will get my House of Representatives to elect you, the guy that didn't get the majority of the electoral votes or popular votes, to elect you President of the United States. So Quincy Adams was like, well, that's pretty fine to me. All right, cool. So what ended up happening was John Quincy Adams won the presidency, Henry Clay became the Secretary of State, William Crawford did whatever he did, and Andrew Jackson got super mad. He ended up winning the next time because everyone was so angry that Andrew Jackson didn't win. But it just shows that even though a president could win electoral and popular votes, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the victor in the House of Representatives election. Just to note, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, not the Speaker of the Senate. So there's only about 1% chance this is even going to happen in 2020. That's about the prediction. One of the reasons it's so low is because over the years there's been a whole bunch of different processes and tools put in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening. One of the biggest reasons is the advent of the two-party system. Since there's only 2 majority parties, there's been a decreased likelihood that electoral votes get spread in such a way that necessitates a House vote. So that's very interesting, but not impossible. As we can see, 1% is not 0%, so we're just going to have to wait and see. It's sure to be an exciting election year, no matter what. Thanks for watching.